The nights of the Wild West were not just about saloons, shootouts, and high-stakes poker games. There was another world hidden behind swinging doors and dimly lit halls, a world where survival meant more than just outdrawing an outlaw. In the brothels that dotted the frontier towns, women lived through nights more dangerous than gunfights at noon. Their stories were rarely told, often buried under whispers and judgment. Yet their courage and struggles shaped the heart of those lawless towns as much as any sheriff or outlaw. Picture a dusty street in Dodge City, Tombstone, or Deadwood. The lamps flicker, the piano music from a saloon drifts into the cold night air, and the raucous laughter of cowboys echoes down the wooden sidewalks. But behind a curtained doorway, in a parlor that smells of whiskey, smoke, and cheap perfume, a group of women sit quietly. Some laugh loudly to hide their fear, others stare at the floor, listening to the boots stomping outside. They knew that once the night truly began, anything could happen. To the outside world, brothel workers were often painted with one brush: women of the night, existing only in the margins of society. But to understand their story, you have to look closer. Many were daughters, widows, or runaway wives. Some came west chasing promises of freedom, only to find themselves cornered by poverty. Others had nowhere else to go. In these brothels, they became entertainers, caretakers, survivors, and sometimes unwilling participants in the chaos that followed men with guns, greed, and tempers. And make no mistake, their nights could be deadly. The frontier towns were filled with men who carried pistols on their hips and whiskey in their veins. Fights broke out easily, and the brothels were often caught in the crossfire. There are stories of drunken cowboys firing bullets through the walls for fun, of jealous husbands barging in with knives, and of bandits who saw the women as easy targets. Survival required more than charm. It demanded wit, toughness, and a careful reading of danger before it exploded. But danger didn't always come in the form of bullets or blades. Disease haunted the rooms more than any outlaw. With little access to medicine, women lived with the constant fear of illness spreading like wildfire. Doctors in the frontier towns were few and often powerless against infections, and even the smallest fever could become fatal. On top of that, shame and stigma followed these women wherever they went. They weren't welcomed in churches. Their children, if they had them, were marked by whispers, and their futures were bound to a reputation that could not easily be escaped. Yet in spite of it all, there was resilience. The women built bonds with each other, creating their own kind of family within the brothel walls. They learned who could be trusted among the townsfolk, which lawmen turned a blind eye, and which gamblers were dangerous. They developed signals to warn each other when trouble walked through the door. Some even struck bargains with local sheriffs for protection, trading information in exchange for a measure of safety. Their survival wasn't an accident. It was the result of a constant, exhausting calculation, night after night. And while most of the men saw the brothel only as a place of escape, for the women it was a battlefield disguised as entertainment. Imagine being dressed in silk, but keeping a knife tucked into the folds of your skirt. Imagine laughing at a drunk's joke while watching his hands carefully, knowing that one wrong move could end in violence. Imagine singing along with the piano, your voice covering the pounding of your own heart as a group of rough outlaws step inside. That was the reality of those nights. What makes these stories even more haunting is how little they were recorded. Historians filled books with tales of sheriffs like Wyatt Earp or outlaws like Jesse James, but rarely did they write down the names of the women who kept the brothels running, who faced just as much danger, if not more. Their courage was quieter, hidden in plain sight, and their sacrifices often forgotten once the towns grew and pushed away their rowdy reputations. But tonight, in this story, we bring them back to life. We walk with them into the smoke-filled rooms. We listen to their laughter, sharp and quick, masking fear. We watch them step carefully between men who carried both money and menace. We hear the echo of boots on wooden floors, the slam of a door that could mean either a good-paying customer or the beginning of disaster. One such night, the women of a well-known brothel in Deadwood gathered nervously. Outside, A gang had just ridden into town. They were drunk, armed, and spoiling for trouble after losing a poker game. The piano player stopped mid-song, sensing the shift in the air. The women exchanged glances. This was the kind of night where anything could happen. Survival would depend not just on luck, but on their quick thinking and unity. As the door swung open, the room filled with the sharp smell of whiskey and the heavy sound of spurred boots. The gang stumbled in, laughing too loud, eyes wild with drink. One of the women forced a smile and greeted them, her voice steady though her hands trembled slightly behind her back. Another quietly slipped toward the back room, ready to send for help if things turned ugly. Everyone else braced themselves, knowing this could turn into one of the deadliest nights they had ever faced. And this was not a story of just one night, but of countless nights when survival meant reading danger in a man's eyes, when whispers and warnings traveled faster than bullets, and when the women of the Wild West had to rely on each other to make it through until morning. The story you're about to hear is not about the glamour of the frontier, it's about the grit. It's about women who fought to survive in towns that barely tolerated them, who carved out lives in the shadows of saloons and gunfighters. It's about the silent strength behind the noise of the Wild West. And on this particular night in Deadwood, as the gang's laughter grew louder and the piano fell silent, the women knew they were about to face a test that would decide whether they lived to see another dawn. The gang's presence shifted the entire mood of the brothel that night. Moments earlier, there had been light chatter, laughter between the women, and the soft, comforting hum of the piano. But once the door slammed shut behind those drunken riders, silence pressed against the walls like a storm about to break. Even the fire in the small hearth seemed to lose its warmth, as if it too braced for the chaos that might unfold. The leader of the gang, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a scruffy beard and a revolver hanging loosely from his hip, tossed his hat onto the floor. His boots clattered heavily as he made his way to the center of the room. His eyes were glassy with drink, yet sharp enough to make the women uneasy. He scanned the faces of the room, lingering on each one as though daring someone to look away. His companions followed his lead, spreading themselves out with that careless confidence that only came from knowing fear usually kept others silent. The women knew the signs. This was not the kind of group that wanted music, drinks, or easy company. These men wanted power. They wanted control. They wanted to prove they could walk into a place and make the world bow down around them. That was always the most dangerous kind of night. Lila, the eldest among the women, straightened her back and forced a smile. She had been in this business long enough to recognize that survival sometimes depended on pretending not to be afraid. "Evening, gentlemen," she said, her voice smooth and even. "You boys look like you've been riding hard. Why don't you sit yourselves down and we'll fetch you something to drink?" Her calm tone was no accident. Lila was what the others often called the anchor. She was the one who steadied nerves when fear threatened to unravel them. Behind her calm smile, however, her heart beat fast. She knew offering them drinks was the safest way to buy time, to gauge whether this would turn into just another rowdy night, or something far worse. One of the younger women, Clara, sat close to the piano. She lowered her gaze, hands folded tightly in her lap. Clara was new to Deadwood, having arrived only weeks earlier from Kansas City. She had been drawn to the West by stories of gold and opportunity, but her reality had been much harsher. She wasn't used to nights like this yet, though she had already learned one truth. You had to read a man's mood like reading a storm in the sky. She glanced quickly toward Lila, searching for reassurance. The gang leader chuckled, a low, heavy sound. "Drinks, huh? That's mighty kind of you, darling." He reached into his pocket and tossed a few gold coins onto the table. The coins clattered against the wood, glinting in the dim light. "Bring us the best whiskey you got, and make it quick." Two of his men sprawled across the chairs, knocking over a lamp in the process. The flames sputtered dangerously before one of the women rushed forward to steady it. The men roared with laughter, as if destruction was just another form of entertainment. Another member of the gang plucked the piano keys with dirty fingers, producing a harsh, tuneless sound. The women exchanged nervous glances, their silent communication sharper than words. Behind the scenes, Mary slipped quietly toward the back hallway. She was the most cautious of them all, the one who always thought 2 steps ahead. Without drawing attention, she moved toward the back door, intending to send word to the sheriff's office. But she hesitated. The sheriff in Deadwood wasn't always reliable. Sometimes he responded, sometimes he didn't. And even if he came, he might decide that whatever happened here wasn't worth his trouble. The women had learned long ago that law and justice were not the same thing in the Wild West. Still, Mary kept moving, because doing nothing could be worse. If things turned violent, they would need someone on their side, even if it was just to pick up the pieces afterward. She stepped into the shadow of the hallway, her footsteps careful, her breath steady, her mind racing with the weight of the decision she was about to make. Back in the parlor, the piano player nervously resumed his song, though his hands trembled on the keys. The tune wavered, shaky and uneven, but it was better than silence. The gang leader leaned against the wall, watching, smiling faintly as though enjoying the tension he had created. It wasn't music he wanted, it was control. For the women, every second felt stretched thin, like a rope about to snap. They knew how quickly men like this could turn. A laugh could shift into a shout. A joke could twist into a threat. The night was always balanced on that razor's edge. Lila continued to keep the men occupied, asking them questions about their ride, their luck at cards, their time in Deadwood. Her tone was light, even playful at times, but her eyes were watchful, her hands steady. She knew she had to keep the attention centered on herself to protect the younger women from being singled out. It was a role she had played many times before, and she carried it with a kind of quiet bravery that came from years of surviving nights like this. But then one of the younger outlaws, a wiry man with mean eyes, slammed his fist on the table. The sound cracked like a gunshot, and everyone froze. "Enough talk," he snarled. His voice cut through the room, sharp and raw. "We didn't come here for chatter. We came here for fun." The piano stopped again. The women stiffened. A few of the men laughed, but it was a cruel, humorless sound. Clara's hands tightened in her lap, and she bit down on her lip to keep from trembling. This was the moment when the night could tip toward disaster. The women exchanged quick glances, the kind of silent communication forged through survival. Lila gave the slightest shake of her head, a signal to stay calm. Mary, still in the hallway, paused with her hand on the back door. She could hear every word, every shift in the room's energy. Her decision weighed heavier than ever, to slip out and risk angering the men if they noticed, or to stay and face the storm with the others. The gang leader smirked, lifting his glass as if to toast. "Easy, boys. Let's not spoil the evening just yet." His voice carried a strange mixture of charm and menace. He took a long sip of whiskey, then set the glass down with a soft clink. His eyes, however, remained sharp, watching the women like a predator watches its prey. For the women, this wasn't just another night of work. This was survival. They knew their lives could change in an instant, depending on the mood of the man before them. Every smile, every word, every movement was calculated, an act of walking a tightrope strung across a pit of danger. And outside, the town of Deadwood carried on, unaware of the storm brewing inside the brothel walls. The streets were noisy with drunken cowboys, gamblers shouting at poker tables, and merchants locking up their shops for the night. But here, behind closed doors, lives were hanging in the balance, and no one outside would know until it was too late. Mary's hand trembled as she touched the cold, iron handle of the door. The choice she made in that moment could mean the difference between life and death. And just as she began to pull it open, the sound of boots thundered across the floor inside the parlor. A chair scraped sharply. A man's voice rose louder. Something was about to happen. Something that would turn this night into one of the deadliest they had ever faced. The chair scraped back hard against the wooden floor, the noise slicing through the room like a knife. Everyone turned sharply. One of the younger outlaws, the wiry one with restless hands, had shot to his feet. His eyes burned with a dangerous mix of drink and temper, and he jabbed a finger toward Clara. "You." the quiet one. "Come here." The command was rough, his voice shaking with anger as though silence itself had offended him. Clara froze. Her body stiffened, her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. She wasn't ready for this moment. She had hoped to fade into the background, to be unseen, and now all eyes were on her. Lila's heart clenched. She knew that once a man singled someone out like this, the situation could spiral fast. She rose slowly, placing herself between the outlaw and Clara. "She's new," Lila said evenly, keeping her tone light. "Doesn't talk much yet. Let her be. I'll keep you company instead." The outlaw sneered. "I didn't ask for you." He stepped forward, the floor creaking under his boots. His hand twitched near his belt where his pistol hung, and the room's air thickened with fear. The piano player froze with his hands hovering over the keys, waiting. Clara's pulse hammered in her throat. She wanted to move, to run, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. The other women watched with wide eyes, every one of them aware that a wrong word could ignite violence. The gang leader finally pushed himself off the wall. His voice, though slurred by whiskey, carried authority among his men. "Sit down," he barked at the wiry outlaw. The room fell silent. "We didn't come here to scare the girls half to death. We came here to have a good night." For a moment, it seemed like his command would settle things. The wiry outlaw's jaw tightened, his hand hovering near his pistol as though weighing whether to obey or not. The tension was unbearable. Then, with a low growl, he kicked the chair back into place and sat down, glaring at Clara the whole time. The women exhaled silently, the relief subtle but powerful. But no one relaxed too much. They all knew how quickly relief could turn back into danger. Mary, still hidden near the back door, leaned her head against the wall. Her palms were damp with sweat. The sheriff. Should she run for him now? The gang leader's word had stopped the storm for now, but storms never stayed calm forever. She imagined sprinting into the night, knocking on a sheriff's door, begging for help. But what if the men noticed she was gone before she returned? What if she made things worse? Her mind spun with the weight of the decision. She thought of Clara's pale face, of Lila's steady courage, of the others sitting frozen in fear. Survival had always been a gamble. Tonight, it felt like rolling dice in the dark. Back in the parlor, the piano player, desperate to break the silence, launched into a tune. The melody was shaky at first, but steadied as he pushed himself to keep playing. The gang leader lifted his glass again, his grin wide, as though he enjoyed the power of pulling his men back from the edge. But not everyone in the room trusted his control. The wiry outlaw leaned close to his companions, muttering darkly. His eyes never left Clara. Every so often, his hand brushed the butt of his pistol. He was like a fuse, waiting for the spark. Lila kept her focus sharp. She moved carefully, pouring more whiskey, offering smiles where she could, deflecting attention when necessary. Every gesture was measured. She was determined not to let the night end in tragedy. Then the front door creaked again. All eyes turned as a stranger stepped inside. He wasn't part of the gang. His coat was dusty, his hat pulled low, his boots worn from travel. He carried himself with quiet confidence, his eyes sweeping the room with the coolness of a man who had seen trouble before. The gang stiffened. "Who the hell are you?" the wiry outlaw demanded, rising halfway from his seat. The stranger removed his hat slowly. His gaze moved not to the outlaws, but to the women first. A quick glance, one that measured fear, tension, danger. Then he looked at the gang leader. "Just a man looking for a drink," he said calmly. The room held its breath. Outsiders were unpredictable. Sometimes they brought peace, sometimes they ignited chaos. The gang leader eyed the stranger carefully. "Plenty of drinks here," he said slowly, testing the man with his words. "But you'd best know how to mind your business." The stranger gave a small nod, as if acknowledging the warning. He moved to the bar, ordered whiskey, and stood quietly. His presence shifted the balance of the room. Not enough to ease the tension, but enough to change the current. For the women, hope flickered. A stranger could be danger, yes, but sometimes strangers were the ones who stepped in when no one else would. Still, they didn't dare count on him yet. They had been let down too many times before. The minutes dragged on, the nights stretching longer than ever. Every laugh from the outlaws sounded too sharp. Every clink of glass felt too loud. Every glance carried the weight of what might come next. Mary's hand gripped the back door again. She whispered a silent prayer, and then she made her choice. With a quick breath, she slipped outside into the cold night air. The door shut behind her with the softest click, but in her mind, it thundered like a gunshot. She hurried into the shadows of Deadwood streets, her boots splashing through patches of mud. Lanterns flickered in the windows of nearby saloons. Voices rose in drunken songs. But Mary's heart raced faster than the night around her. She had to reach the sheriff before the gang realized she was gone. Back in the brothel, Clara finally lifted her head. Her eyes flicked to Lila, then to the stranger at the bar, and finally back to the wiry outlaw, still glaring at her. She didn't know what the night would bring, but deep inside, she felt the pull of something stronger than fear, the stubborn spark of survival. The stranger sipped his whiskey slowly. His eyes never strayed too far from the gang. And though his words had been calm, his posture told another story. This was a man ready for trouble if it came. The women waited, every second heavier than the last. The gang muttered, drank, and prowled the room with restless energy. The piano player's fingers ached as he tried to keep the tune alive, his eyes darting nervously between the keys and the men who might, at any moment, decide the music should stop. And in the middle of it all, the women of Deadwood's brothel carried themselves with quiet strength, knowing that dawn felt impossibly far away. Because sooner or later, the storm would break. And when it did, not everyone in that room would walk away unscathed. Mary's breath came in sharp bursts as she darted down Deadwood's narrow street, the night air biting her skin. Every sound around her seemed louder than usual. The creak of a swinging sign, the stomp of boots from a nearby saloon, the faint whinny of a restless horse tied to a post. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and moved quickly, praying no one noticed her sudden departure. She had learned early in her time at the brothel that disappearing without explanation could invite questions, or worse, retaliation. But she also knew that staying behind meant watching the night spiral into violence. And if she could bring back the sheriff, maybe, just maybe, there'd be a chance to keep the others safe. The sheriff's office was on the far side of town, just past the saloons that blazed with drunken noise. She quickened her pace, her boots slipping on loose gravel, her heart pounding as though trying to outrun her own fear. Meanwhile, back in the parlor, the gang grew restless. The wiry outlaw kept drumming his fingers on the table, his glare fixed on Clara like a hawk circling prey. Lila shifted slightly, keeping herself between him and the girl, her smile unbroken though her stomach churned with nerves. She knew Clara's fear would only fuel the man's temper, so she tried to carry the weight for both of them. The piano music filled the room again, but it was strained, faltering. The gang leader noticed and barked a laugh. "Play louder," he demanded, slapping the bar with his hand. "Let's hear something worth listening to." The piano player obeyed, striking the keys harder, though sweat beaded his brow. His shoulders ached, but he knew silence wasn't an option. Music was the fragile thread holding the room together, and if it snapped, chaos would rush in. The stranger at the bar remained quiet, his hat still resting on the counter. He seemed almost detached, but the truth was he watched every move. His eyes lingered on the wiry outlaw, then on the leader, then on the women. He could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface, waiting for one spark to ignite it. And though he hadn't spoken since ordering his drink, the air around him carried a subtle warning. He wasn't just another passerby. Lila noticed it too. She studied the stranger in quick glances, wondering if he might become an ally if things went wrong. But allies in Deadwood were rare and unpredictable. Still, something about his calmness gave her a sliver of hope. In the back hallway, one of the other women, Ruth, finally realized Mary was gone. She froze, her eyes darting toward the parlor, then back to the door where Mary had slipped out. Fear twisted in her chest. If the men discovered Mary missing, they might assume the worst, that someone had gone for help, and their reaction would be swift and violent. Ruth bit her lip and forced herself to stay still. The best thing she could do was to keep the secret until the last possible moment. Out on the streets, Mary neared the sheriff's office. She could see the faint glow of a lantern burning inside, casting long shadows across the wooden floorboards. Relief surged through her veins. She rushed forward, nearly tripping as she climbed the steps and pounded on the door. Inside, Sheriff James McAllister sat at his desk, boots propped up, hat tilted over his eyes. He had been half dozing, the night quiet except for the muffled sounds of Deadwood's rowdy saloons. The knock jolted him awake. He lifted his hat and frowned at the door. "Who's knocking at this hour?" he muttered, pulling himself to his feet. When he opened the door, Mary nearly stumbled inside. Her cheeks were flushed, her breath heavy, her eyes wide with fear. "Sheriff," she gasped, clutching the edge of the doorframe. "You've got to come now. There's trouble at the brothel. A gang's inside. They're drunk, armed," and her voice broke, trembling with urgency. "Please, if you don't come, someone's going to get hurt." The sheriff's jaw tightened. He wasn't a stranger to trouble in Deadwood, and he knew the brothel was often where it began or ended. He grabbed his gun belt from the chair and fastened it around his waist, his eyes locking on Mary's. "Stay here," he ordered firmly. "You're safe now. I'll handle it." But Mary shook her head fiercely. "I can't stay. The others, Clara, Lila, Ruth, they need me. I can't just leave them." The sheriff hesitated. He respected her determination, but he knew the risk. Finally, he nodded. "Fine, but you stay behind me. You understand? Behind me." Together, they stepped out into the night, the sheriff moving with brisk strides, Mary trailing close but keeping her promise. The sound of his spurs echoed on the wooden boards as they cut back toward the heart of town. Back at the brothel, the gang's mood began to shift again. The wiry outlaw rose once more, this time kicking his chair aside. "Enough with the music," he shouted, his voice cracking with fury. He drew his pistol in a flash, the metal gleaming in the lamplight. The piano player froze mid-note, his hands suspended over the keys. The women gasped softly, their fear filling the room like smoke. Clara pressed herself back into the chair, her eyes wide with terror. Lila stood taller, her voice steady despite the fear clawing inside her. "There's no need for that," she said. "Put the gun away, and we can keep this night easy." The outlaw sneered. "Easy?" His voice dripped with mockery. "I didn't ride into this dump for easy. I rode in for fun." The gang leader pushed forward, his hands slapping down hard on the table. "Put it away," he growled at his companion. For a moment, the room teetered on a knife's edge. One wrong move, one wrong word, and it would all explode. The stranger at the bar shifted slightly, his hand resting casually on the counter, but ready in a way that only men who had seen violence before could be. His eyes locked on the wiry outlaw's gun, his body tense, waiting. Clara's chest rose and fell in rapid breaths. Her gaze darted toward the door, silently praying for it to burst open, for someone to step in, for the nightmare to end. And then, as if answering her unspoken plea, heavy boots pounded up the steps outside. The door rattled under a firm knock. The gang snapped their heads toward the sound. Silence gripped the room again, so thick it almost choked them. The sheriff's voice cut through it, calm but commanding. "Open up." The gang leader's smile faded. His eyes narrowed. The wiry outlaw tightened his grip on his pistol. The women's hearts raced in unison. Help had arrived, but had it come in time? Or would the sheriff's presence spark the very bloodshed they had been trying to avoid all night? Lila's hand trembled at her side, though she kept her face calm. Clara swallowed hard, her throat dry. Ruth held her breath in the back hallway. The sheriff's hand pressed firmly on the door again. "I said open up." And in that instant, everyone in the room knew. The night had reached its breaking point. Something irreversible was about to happen. Something that would be remembered in Deadwood for years to come. The nights in those Wild West towns always carried a weight, a strange tension that seemed to live in the air, heavy and unspoken. The saloon stayed lit long after the lamps on the main street flickered out, and behind those glowing doors, another kind of survival played out. The women who worked in the brothels had to measure each step, every word, and every smile, because danger could come from anywhere. It wasn't just the drifters with whiskey on their breath or the gamblers with nothing left to lose. It could be the lawman himself, or even the man who owned the very roof over their heads. Their lives weren't measured in years, but in nights, each one unpredictable, each one demanding strength that went far beyond what the outside world ever saw. Many of these women came from hard beginnings. Some have been abandoned on wagon trails. Others have fled farms where hunger left little room for dreams. A few were educated, daughters of merchants or ministers who had fallen on hard times, their choices stolen by circumstance. When they arrived in towns like Deadwood, Dodge City, or Tombstone, they carried not just their past, but also the weight of knowing the West had little mercy for women without protection. In brothels, they found a form of shelter, walls, food, a bed, but it was never safety in the true sense. Safety was a fragile illusion, easily shattered when tempers flared and revolvers were drawn. The madams who ran these houses often had sharp minds and even sharper instincts. They were survivors in their own right, women who had weathered storms of betrayal and hardship until they carved out a corner of control in a world ruled by men. They taught the younger ones not just how to smile or dance, but how to watch. "Keep your eyes open," they'd whisper. "A man's hands will tell you more than his words. His eyes will warn you before his mouth does." Those lessons became lifelines. A misplaced glance could be the difference between a night ending in laughter or in blood. Behind closed doors, bonds formed between the women. They were not just co-workers. They became sisters in survival, holding each other up when grief threatened to drag them under. When one fell ill, the others nursed her. When one wept, they listened, even if they themselves had no comfort left to give. It was an unspoken code, forged in the fires of shared fear and shared resilience. They knew the world outside would never understand them. They were judged by strangers, pitted by some, condemned by others. But within those walls, they created their own form of family. Still, the threats were constant. Rival saloons sent men to cause trouble. Drunks stumbled in spoiling for fights. And sometimes the danger was quieter, creeping in slowly, like a sickness that spread from town to town. In those years, outbreaks of disease swept through brothels like wildfire. Doctors rarely came, and when they did, they often treated the women with disdain. So the workers learned to care for one another with home remedies, whispered cures passed down like secret maps to survival. They boiled herbs, stitched wounds, and prayed through fevers, never knowing if the morning would bring relief or loss. Money was both blessing and curse. A good night could mean coins enough for warm food and maybe even a dream of leaving. A bad night could mean debts owed to the madam, or worse, a dangerous man demanding what he thought was his due. And beyond the walls of the brothel, there was always the shadow of the street. Outlaws drifted through town with pistols swinging at their sides. And more than once, a quarrel between gunmen spilled through the doors, catching the women in the crossfire of feuds they had no part in. Survival meant learning when to vanish into the background, when to speak softly, and when silence was the only shield. But the most dangerous nights weren't always the ones with flying bullets or broken glass. Sometimes, the deadliest nights were the quiet ones, when the streets fell still and the only sound was the creak of the wooden floorboards beneath hurried footsteps. That was when fear pressed hardest against their ribs. Who was creeping up the stairs? Was it a man with anger in his chest, or one carrying secrets no one dared speak of? Those moments stretched time thin, each heartbeat echoing like a drum. The West was full of myths about cowboys and gunfights, about sheriffs standing tall in dusty streets. But the untold stories were written in whispers inside those brothels, where survival meant outthinking, outlasting, and outwaiting dangers that didn't make it into ballads. These women bore witness to everything: the rise of fortunes, the fall of men, the greed that built towns, and the violence that sometimes tore them apart. And while others remembered the West for its lawmen and outlaws, the truth was that without the unseen endurance of these women, the towns themselves might never have held together. Each new arrival to the brothel learned quickly that survival was not about beauty or charm alone. It was about resilience. They learned the sound of breaking glass before it fell, the twitch of a gambler's eye before he snapped, the way silence in the saloon sometimes carried more danger than the sound of laughter. They carried secrets too, secrets of men who would never want their names spoken, secrets that could topple reputations if ever revealed. That knowledge was its own kind of weapon, though it came with its own kind of risk. And so, as another night fell and lamps flickered in windows across the town, the women braced themselves once more. The air smelled of dust and whiskey, of sweat and smoke, of stories that would never be written down. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then fell silent. The piano player kept the saloon lively, masking the tension that crept like a shadow into every corner. They knew tonight could be like any other, rowdy, unpredictable, maybe even profitable. Or it could be one of those nights, the kind that left scars, the kind they would whisper about for years. No one could say which it would be. That was the cruel gamble of life in the Wild West brothels. But as the door creaked open and heavy boots thudded across the wooden floor, every woman lifted her head, every instinct sharpened. Somewhere in the dark, the next test of survival was already waiting, and none of them could know how close danger had come until it was too late. The boots that echoed across the wooden floor that night weren't just ordinary footsteps. They carried a weight that every ear in the brothel could recognize. It was the sound of a man who walked as though the room already belonged to him, the kind of sound that pulled every pair of eyes upward even before he reached the saloon doors. The piano player hesitated for just a second, his hands slipping on the keys before the music picked up again, louder this time, almost as if it could hide the unease that spread through the air. The women exchanged glances that spoke without words. They had all seen this type before. Men who didn't come for laughter or escape, but for something else, something heavier. The man's spurs clinked as he stepped inside, his shadow stretching long in the lamplight. He wasn't the rowdy kind, not the sort who threw coins on the bar and shouted for whiskey. No, this one carried himself with a cold stillness, the kind that made everyone careful. Maggie, one of the older women who had seen more nights than most, felt the air tighten around her. She'd been in the West long enough to know that the quiet ones were often the most dangerous. She leaned closer to the younger girl beside her, Clara, whose trembling hands betrayed her nerves. "Don't meet his eyes," Maggie whispered softly. "Not yet." The man moved through the saloon without rushing, his gaze scanning the room as though measuring every soul inside. Some men came in looking for escape, others for warmth, but this one, he looked as if he came searching for something he had already lost. His presence was unsettling, and even the men at the bar fell into silence. The madam, Miss Evelyn, descended the staircase with deliberate grace. She had seen this play out before, the arrival of men who brought trouble stitched into their coats. With her chin lifted and her eyes calm, she stepped forward to meet him, her voice steady. "Welcome, stranger. Long ride behind you, I'd reckon." The man gave the faintest nod, but didn't smile. His voice, low and steady, carried enough weight to hush the piano for good. "I've been riding hard, ma'am, looking for a place to rest my boots." Rest. That was the word he chose, but everyone listening knew there was more behind it. His eyes weren't tired. They were watchful, sharp, hunting. And though Evelyn smiled warmly, her mind was already calculating. She could sense when the night was about to turn. In the back of the room, Clara's breath caught. She was new to the brothel, only weeks in her life there, and each night still felt like stepping into the unknown. Maggie reached for her hand beneath the table, squeezing it gently to remind her she wasn't alone. For the younger women, survival often came through the quiet strength of the older ones, who had walked through storms and somehow still stood. The stranger removed his hat slowly, his gaze sweeping the room once more. The women noticed his hands, steady, controlled, never trembling, even as they brushed the dust from his coat. Men like him didn't need to boast. Their silence was a warning in itself. Outside, the wind howled down the empty street, rattling shutters and sending dust spinning through the air. It was as if the town itself was holding its breath. Evelyn offered him a drink, her words laced with practiced charm. "Whiskey's strong tonight. Might help ease the road from your bones." He accepted, but when his hand reached for the glass, his eyes met Clara's across the room. For the briefest moment, her chest tightened. She hadn't meant to meet his gaze, but there it was, sharp and unrelenting. She felt seen in a way that wasn't comforting but unsettling, like a rabbit caught in the open under a hawk's shadow. Maggie pulled her closer, murmuring, "Keep your head down, girl. He's not here for you." But Clara wasn't so sure. Something in his look lingered, a heaviness that made her skin prickle. She lowered her eyes, but the damage was already done. The night stretched on, tense and uncertain. The saloon filled with laughter that sounded forced, with glasses clinking too loudly, with songs sung off-key. Everyone seemed to work harder than usual to keep the air lively, as though trying to mask the unease. But the women knew better. They could read the shift in the room like the change in a man's breathing before his temper broke. Whispers passed quietly between them. Some said the stranger was a bounty hunter, others swore he was an outlaw on the run. Clara, with her heart pounding, wondered if he carried with him some ghost from the past, something that had followed him all the way to their door. As the hour grew later, the streets outside emptied, the last lamps dimmed, and the brothel became its own little world of smoke, music, and hidden fear. Yet the stranger remained, his drink untouched, his eyes flicking now and then toward Clara despite Maggie's careful shield. Evelyn noticed it too. She walked past Clara's table, resting a hand on her shoulder in a way that was both comforting and protective. The madam's voice was light as she spoke to the stranger, but beneath it lay steel. "We're all friends here, sir. No need for trouble tonight." His lips curved in what could almost be called a smile, though it held no warmth. "No trouble," he said softly. "Not unless someone makes it." The words hung in the air, heavy as a drawn pistol. No one replied. Even the piano player had gone still, his hands frozen above the keys. Clara's pulse hammered in her ears. She wanted to slip away, to vanish upstairs and lock her door, but something kept her rooted to her seat. Maybe it was fear, maybe something else, curiosity, perhaps about who this man was and why his gaze seemed to follow her. In the corners of the brothel, the older women exchanged glances. They had lived through enough to know the signs of a storm before it broke. And tonight, it felt like a storm was already pressing against the walls, waiting for the smallest spark to unleash itself. Evelyn remained calm, her presence steady like a shield for all the women watching. But even she knew that not every storm could be contained by words. Some nights, survival meant facing the unknown, standing steady when the ground beneath you trembled. And as the clock ticked past midnight, the stranger leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Clara. The night had not yet shown its hand, but everyone in the room could feel it. The sense that something was coming, something that would change the course of this quiet brothel forever. What none of them knew was whether they'd survive it. The minutes crawled by, and each one felt heavier than the last. Every sound in the brothel seemed louder. The clink of glass, the shuffle of cards, the scrape of a chair leg across the wooden floor. Yet beneath it all ran a silence, an unspoken fear that everyone felt but no one dared to name. The stranger remained still at his table, his whiskey barely touched, his presence as unsettling as a thundercloud looming over a dry plain. Clara tried to steady her breath, her hands trembling despite Maggie's calming grip on her wrist. She was still so new to this life, still learning what it meant to live night after night in a world where every choice carried a hidden risk. She had left behind a broken family farm in Missouri, thinking the West would hold promise, maybe even freedom. But freedom was a word she had not tasted in months. Here, survival was all that mattered. And tonight, survival felt as fragile as a candle flame in the wind. Miss Evelyn drifted between the tables with her usual poise, her voice like honey poured over sharp steel. She laughed when laughter was needed, redirected conversations when tensions rose, and cast glances that spoke louder than words to the women under her roof. They trusted her because Evelyn had walked through fire more than once and come out unburned. She was their shield, though even shields had limits. And she felt tonight pressing against those limits like never before. In the far corner, another woman named June whispered to one of the younger girls, Lottie. June had been in the brothel for nearly a decade, long enough to know the difference between a man looking for company and one looking for control. That man, she murmured, nodding subtly toward the stranger, ain't come here for comfort. He's hunting. Mark my words. Lottie's eyes widened, fear tightening her voice. Hunting for who? June didn't answer. The truth was she didn't know, but she trusted her instincts, and they were screaming that this night would not end quietly. The piano player started up again, fingers uncertain at first, but gaining speed as the melody filled the room. It was a simple tune, something meant to cover the unease, but the music couldn't soften the tension that stretched taut across the room. Then, without warning, the stranger stood. His chair creaked back on its legs, and every head turned toward him. He moved with that same quiet control, his boots heavy on the floorboards, each step deliberate. He didn't go to the bar. He didn't head for the door. He walked straight toward Clara's table. Her heart nearly stopped. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the wooden chair and become invisible. Maggie moved quickly, rising to her feet, her body angled just enough to block the man's path. "Evening, sir," she said firmly, her voice carrying the weight of years. "If you're looking for company, you'll have to speak to the madam first." The stranger paused, his eyes flicking to Maggie with the faintest hint of acknowledgement. But his gaze slid past her almost immediately, locking once again on Clara. Evelyn appeared before the silence could grow too sharp. She stepped between the stranger and the table with a practiced grace, her smile warm, but her words laced with warning. "I run a respectable house, sir. You'll treat my girls with kindness, or you won't treat them at all." The man tilted his head slightly, studying her. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then he spoke, his voice calm and steady. "I mean no disrespect. I'm just looking for a girl who came through this town. Thought maybe she'd found her way here." His words sent ripples through the women. They all knew what it meant when a man came searching. Sometimes it was an old lover, sometimes a debt, sometimes worse. Clara's blood ran cold, though she had no idea why. Evelyn's tone didn't waver. "Plenty of women pass through Dodge. What's the name of this one you're after?" The stranger's lips curved into that almost smile again, though it carried no warmth. "Name don't matter much. She'd be young, pale hair, scared eyes." His gaze shifted once more to Clara. "Eyes like hers." The words dropped heavy in the silence. Clara's throat tightened as if the very air had turned against her. She shook her head quickly, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know you." The man studied her a long moment, then finally tipped his hat to Evelyn. "Maybe I was mistaken," but his tone said otherwise. And though he returned to his table, the damage had already been done. Clara knew, with a sinking certainty, that she had become the center of whatever storm he carried with him. The women closed in around her after that, moving with quiet purpose. Maggie placed herself firmly at Clara's side, while June whispered sharp warnings about keeping her door locked tight that night. Even Evelyn, who rarely showed fear, cast Clara a look that spoke volumes. No one asked the questions aloud, but they all thought them. Who was this man? What past did Clara carry that might have drawn him here? And most dangerously, what would happen if he didn't find what he was looking for? The night dragged on, every minute sharper than the last. Men came and went, laughter rose and fell, but the stranger remained. He didn't drink, didn't speak much, just sat in his corner like a shadow that refused to leave. Clara couldn't shake his eyes from her mind, the way they had searched her face as though she were the answer to a question no one else could hear. When the hour grew late and most of the town had gone dark, Evelyn gave the signal for the night to wind down. The piano player packed up, the lamps were dimmed, and the last of the customers stumbled out into the cold. But the stranger lingered until the very last moment, his boots heavy on the stairs as he finally left. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For a moment, she thought maybe it was over, that the danger had passed with the closing of the door. But Maggie's face told her otherwise. "That man'll be back," Maggie said grimly. "And when he comes, he won't be asking polite." Clara shivered, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The night outside seemed colder than before, darker somehow. She thought of the long road that had brought her here, of the choices that had left her with no other refuge. And now, she wondered if even this place, fragile and dangerous as it was, could protect her from whatever shadow had just walked through their door. The lamps flickered, the wind rattled the shutters, and somewhere out on the empty street, boots echoed once more before fading into silence. The women exchanged uneasy glances, each of them knowing that survival in the West was never just about one night. It was about bracing for the storm that always came after. And tonight, they all felt it pressing closer. The following day in Dodge began like any other, the sun climbing slow over the rooftops and spilling gold across the dusty streets. But inside the brothel, there was no sense of ease. The women moved quietly, their voices hushed, their eyes flicking off into the front door as if expecting it to swing open at any moment. Even laughter, which usually floated through the house in the mornings when the men were gone, was scarce. The memory of the stranger lingered like smoke that refused to clear. Clara spent much of the day upstairs, sitting at her window and staring at the empty street below. She tried to steady her nerves, telling herself the man was just passing through, that he would keep riding and never look back. Yet deep inside, she knew better. His eyes hadn't been the eyes of a man just wandering. He had been searching, and somehow he had found her. Maggie brought her tea, setting the cup gently on the table. "You can't sit here fretting all day," she said kindly but firmly. "Fear don't do nothing but eat you alive." "I don't understand," Clara whispered. "Why me? I don't know that man. I've never seen him before." Maggie gave her a long look, the lines on her face deepening with memory. "Out here, sometimes the past has a way of chasing folks, even when they don't know what they're running from. Maybe he mistook you for someone else. Or maybe—" She trailed off, not finishing the thought. Clara turned toward her, desperate. "Or maybe what?" But Maggie only shook her head and said, "We'll keep you safe. That's what matters." Downstairs, Miss Evelyn gathered the women in the parlor. Her presence was calm, but her words were edged with resolve. "Listen closely, all of you. That man from last night isn't gone. I've seen his kind before. He'll circle back, and when he does, we'll be ready. No one's to be left alone, not even for a moment. Keep the doors bolted. Keep your heads clear." June crossed her arms, her voice low. "And if he decides he wants more than just answers?" Evelyn's gaze hardened. "Then he'll learn this house isn't as easy to shake as he thinks." The women nodded, drawing strength from her words, though each of them felt the same cold knot of unease in their stomachs. Survival in the West was often a game of waiting, and waiting was always the hardest part. By evening, the town was alive again. Cowboys filled the saloons, gamblers crowded the tables, and music spilled into the streets. From the upstairs window, Clara watched groups of men stumble along the boardwalks, their laughter loud and careless. But even in the noise of the night, she listened for one sound, the heavy, deliberate steps she remembered from the stranger. And then, just as the lamps inside the brothel were being lit, the sound came. Boots, slow and steady, striking against the wood. The laughter on the street seemed to dim as if the whole town turned to listen. Clara's breath caught. Maggie, standing close by, placed a hand on her arm. The door creaked open, and there he was again, hat pulled low, eyes sharp as ever. He paused in the entryway, surveying the room like a man stepping into familiar ground. The piano faltered, then stopped altogether, silence swallowing the air. Miss Evelyn stepped forward, her chin high. "Back again so soon," she said, her voice steady. The stranger nodded once. "Told you I was looking for someone." "And I told you," Evelyn replied, "that plenty of women pass through Dodge. You'll not find her answers here." He let the words hang in the air, then looked past her, his eyes landing once more on Clara. She felt the weight of it like iron pressing down on her chest. Maggie moved subtly, shielding Clara with her body, but the stranger's gaze never shifted. "Girl," he said, his voice low but carrying. "You sure you don't know me?" Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to say no, to shout it, but the words stuck. All she managed was a shaky whisper. "Don't." The man studied her for a long moment before finally setting his hat down on the nearest table. "Then maybe you know someone who looks a whole lot like you. Someone who's running from a debt. Or maybe a crime." A murmur rippled through the room. The women exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes darting between Clara and the stranger. Clara shook her head quickly, panic rising. "I've never done anything. I don't know what you're talking about." The stranger leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "Funny thing about the West. Folks think they can run, but the past has a way of catching up." Evelyn stepped closer, her voice hard as steel. "That's enough. Whatever business you've got, it ends at my door. You won't bring it in here." For a long moment, it seemed as if the man might push back. His jaw tightened, his eyes darkened. But then, slowly, he straightened and reached for his hat. "I'll be around," he said softly, almost like a promise. Then he turned and walked out into the night, the door swinging shut behind him. The silence that followed was suffocating. Clara's chest heaved as if she'd been holding her breath the whole time. The other women closed in around her, their faces filled with worry. "He's not done," June said grimly. "Mark my words, that man's coming back again." Evelyn nodded. "And when he does, we'll be ready. But until then, not one of you is to walk this town alone. Do you understand?" The women agreed, though fear still lingered in their eyes. Clara slipped upstairs, her legs weak beneath her. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the door, her mind spinning. She didn't know who that man was or why he had chosen her, but she felt it deep in her bones. He would not stop until he got what he wanted. The night outside stretched on, filled with shouts and laughter from the saloons, but none of it reached Clara. She sat in the dark, clutching the edge of her blanket, listening for the sound of boots in the street below. She knew he was out there somewhere, waiting, and as the hours crawled by, she couldn't shake the fear that maybe Maggie had been right. Maybe the past had come for her, even if she didn't understand how. The West was unforgiving, and Clara was learning fast that danger didn't always announce itself with a gun. Sometimes it came with quiet footsteps and eyes that looked too deeply. And tonight, that danger was closer than ever. The moon hung low over the small frontier town, its pale light casting long shadows across the dusty main street. Inside the Red Lantern, the air was heavy with smoke, perfume, and the muffled voices of cowhands, gamblers, and travelers seeking comfort after long days on the trail. Yet behind the laughter and music, a constant tension pressed down on the women who worked there. They knew that while the brothel promised shelter, food, and coin, it also carried dangers that could erupt without warning. The Wild West was a place where law often came too late, and on some nights, survival depended on instinct, quick thinking, and the bonds the women formed with one another. Sadie leaned against the worn wooden railing at the top of the stairs, her sharp eyes scanning the room below. She wasn't just watching for trouble. She was learning, memorizing who had drunk too much whiskey, who carried a revolver too loosely at their side, and who was eyeing the card tables with suspicion. She had survived long enough in towns like this to know that the nights when the music was loudest and the laughter strongest were often the nights when chaos struck hardest. The men saw the Red Lantern as a place of escape, but for Sadie and the others, it was a place where every choice carried weight. Mary, the quiet newcomer, sat near the corner with her hands folded nervously in her lap. She had arrived from the East weeks earlier, fleeing a past she never spoke of. The other women knew better than to ask. In this line of work, everyone carried secrets, and sometimes secrets were safer left untouched. Yet Mary's wide eyes gave her away. She wasn't used to nights filled with drunken brawls, or the sound of boots stomping against the creaking floors, or the sharp sound of laughter that could turn to shouting in an instant. Sadie had taken her under her wing, reminding her again and again that survival meant learning how to read people before they spoke. Downstairs, the piano player banged out a lively tune, but the unease in the room grew with every passing minute. A group of cowboys had entered earlier, dusty and restless after weeks on the trail. Their leader, a broad man with a scar across his cheek, leaned too close to Clara, the Red Lantern's most experienced woman. Clara knew how to smile and turn her head just enough to keep a man interested without letting him too close. But tonight the scarred cowboy wasn't paying attention to her cues. His hand lingered on her arm, his laugh too loud, his voice cutting through the music. Sadie's eyes narrowed. Trouble was coming, and it was coming fast. She moved silently down the stairs, her boots hitting the floor just as the scarred man shoved away from the bar, his whiskey spilling across the counter. The room hushed, the music faltering. Every eye turned to the cowboy, and every woman in the Red Lantern felt the same shiver of dread. Nights like this could end in broken glass, blood on the floorboards, or worse. What made survival possible wasn't luck, but the unspoken pact between the women. They looked out for each other, even if the outside world saw them as little more than shadows in the night. Clara's eyes flicked towards Sadie, and in that moment a plan formed without a single word being spoken. Mary, still in the corner, watched with her heart racing. She didn't yet understand how quickly things could change in a place like this. She thought the danger came from the guns on the men's hips, but the real danger was in the unpredictability, the way a laugh could turn to rage, the way a promise could break into a threat in the blink of an eye. She leaned forward, her breath shallow, sensing that something bigger was about to unfold. As the cowboy's voice grew louder, the saloon doors swung open, and in walked Sheriff Harlan. His presence didn't quiet the room. It shifted the air entirely. The sheriff was a man people respected, but he was also a man feared. He had the look of someone who had seen too much, someone who carried the law not just on his chest but in his eyes. The cowboy stiffened when he noticed him, though his grip on Clara's arm didn't loosen. "Evening," the sheriff said, his voice low but steady. The room held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The women of the Red Lantern understood this was the thin line they always walked. Survival wasn't just about keeping themselves safe, it was about keeping the fragile balance of the room intact. A wrong word, a wrong move, and the night could spiral into chaos. Sadie stepped closer to Clara, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. She knew this was her chance to guide the storm, to steer it away before it broke wide open. But she also knew that some storms couldn't be tamed. Upstairs, the other women huddled near the balcony, watching, whispering, their own fears mirrored in one another's faces. They knew the dangers of men drunk on whiskey and pride, and they knew that the sheriff's arrival didn't always mean protection. It sometimes meant judgment, and judgment was something women like them rarely escaped unscathed. Mary's hands trembled as she clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She had thought she'd left fear behind when she left her old life, but sitting in the Red Lantern that night, she realized survival in the Wild West wasn't about outrunning fear. It was about living with it, carrying it with every step, and learning to face it in ways she had never imagined. The music didn't start again. The room stayed tense, every person caught between silence and the possibility of violence. The sheriff's eyes moved from the scarred cowboy to Sadie, then back again. He was measuring, calculating, deciding whether to act or wait. The cowboy let out a sharp laugh, though it didn't reach his eyes. His grip on Clara's arm finally loosened, but the damage had already been done. The air was thick with the knowledge that this night wasn't finished, not by a long shot. Something lingered, an undercurrent of danger that would resurface before the night was over. And Mary, though still new to this world, understood one thing clearly now. The Red Lantern wasn't just a brothel. It was a battlefield in disguise, and the women who worked there weren't just entertainers. They were survivors, fighters in a war that was fought not with armies, but with resilience, cunning, and courage. But even the strongest survivors couldn't predict what was coming next. Somewhere in the shadows of that small frontier town, forces were moving. Forces that would test every bond, every choice, and every fragile moment of peace the women try to hold on to. The night was far from over, and the deadliest hours had yet to arrive. The sheriff's presence in the Red Lantern that night did not settle the air. it only deepened the uncertainty. Sheriff Harlan stood tall, his broad shoulders framed by the doorway, his eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. Everyone in the room felt the weight of his stare, even those who tried to keep their eyes on their whiskey glasses or their cards. The scarred cowboy shifted uneasily, but he wasn't ready to back down completely. Men like him rarely did. Pride was as dangerous as any revolver in the Wild West, and pride had sparked more violence than gold, land, or law. Clara eased herself free of his grip, keeping her voice calm. "Maybe we all just need another round," she said softly, her smile carefully painted on. She wasn't speaking to him so much as to the entire room, offering them a way out, a chance to let the night move on without bloodshed. But her words only half worked. The cowboy gave a short, bitter laugh, then slammed his empty glass down on the counter. Sadie stood closer now, her steady presence a shield Clara could lean on. Sadie knew this man wasn't just drunk. He was itching for something, maybe a fight, maybe a show of power. She had seen his type before, and she knew that if he didn't find trouble here, he'd make it somewhere else before the night ended. The sheriff finally stepped forward, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "You've had enough," he said simply, his voice calm but edged with iron. There was no shouting, no drawn gun, just that flat, undeniable tone that carried the authority of the badge pinned to his chest. The cowboy sneered, but there was hesitation in his movements now. His friends muttered behind him, urging him not to push too far, but his pride held him like chains. He spat on the floor, muttered something under his breath, and then, with a final glance at Clara, turned away. The Red Lantern exhaled as one, the tension breaking like a storm that had just passed overhead. But Sadie knew storms had a way of circling back. The sheriff's eyes lingered on her for a moment before he tipped his hat and walked back out into the night. No one spoke until the saloon doors creaked shut behind him. Then, slowly, the music started again, laughter returning like a cautious guest. Yet even with the piano's notes filling the air once more, the mood had shifted. Mary clutched her shawl tighter and leaned towards Sadie when she returned. "Does it always feel like this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Sadie gave her a faint smile, but her eyes were tired. "Only on the nights that matter," she said. Mary didn't fully understand what that meant, but she felt the truth in it. The women here had grown used to nights like this, nights where their survival hinged on reading a man's temper, on calming a storm before it broke, or on knowing when to stand together and when to step aside. As the night stretched on, the Red Lantern filled with more customers. Some were harmless, men too tired to fight, too eager to lose themselves in laughter or whiskey. Others carried shadows with them, the kind that made every woman instinctively stiffen. These men weren't looking for company, they were looking for control. And it was these encounters, quiet at first, that often became the most dangerous. Clara found herself watching the door as much as she watched the men at her table. She had worked long enough to know patterns. The nights when cowboys stumbled in after payday, the nights when gamblers showed up riding the high of a winning streak or the fury of a loss, and the nights when outlaws drifted through, carrying with them the weight of violence that didn't need a reason to ignite. Tonight, she sensed something brewing beyond the walls of the Red Lantern, something that hadn't yet reached their door. Meanwhile, Mary was learning. She studied Sadie and Clara closely, copying their gestures, their way of speaking, the way they laughed without revealing too much. She understood that survival here was an art, and every woman was an artist in her own way. Some used charm, some used wit, and some, like Sadie, used silence and sharp eyes to make themselves untouchable. But Mary's inexperience made her vulnerable, and Sadie knew it. She stayed close, guiding her with subtle signals, a raised brow, a small shake of the head, a gentle nudge when it was time to step back. Mary clung to these lessons, knowing that each night she survived was another piece of armor she built around herself. As the hours passed, the scarred cowboy returned with his friends. They had slipped out after the sheriff left, but instead of cooling off, they had found more whiskey. Now, their voices were louder, their movements sloppier, their eyes sharper with reckless daring. Sadie tensed. Clara noticed too. Mary froze. This was the danger of the Wild West. Trouble didn't leave when the sheriff walked through the door. It waited outside, gathered strength, and came back twice as strong. The cowboys stormed back into the Red Lantern, and though they tried to appear casual, their eyes betrayed their intentions. The piano faltered once again, and the room braced itself for the return of the storm. Sadie met Clara's gaze across the room. They didn't speak, but they didn't need to. They both knew this wasn't going to end as easily as it had earlier. The question wasn't whether trouble would come, it was how bad it would be, and whether they'd all survive it. Mary clutched her shawl so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had prayed she'd left fear behind in the East, but tonight she realized she had only walked into a deeper kind of danger, one that no distance could escape. The cowboys laughed, loud and forced, and the scar man fixed his gaze on Clara again. This time, there was no sheriff stepping through the door. This time, it would be up to the women of the Red Lantern and the fragile alliances they had built to decide how the night would end. And somewhere deep in Mary's chest, a question rose that she couldn't silence. How many more nights like this could she survive? And how many more would she have to face before the Wild West consumed her the way it had consumed so many before her? The answers, she knew, would come before the sun rose. The night was only getting darker, and the deadliest hours still lay ahead. The laughter of the scarred cowboy and his friends echoed through the Red Lantern, bouncing off the wooden walls like a warning bell. It wasn't the kind of laughter that came from joy. It was the sharp, brutal laughter of men daring someone to challenge them. Every woman in the room felt it crawl across her skin like cold steel. The piano player's hands hesitated over the keys, then dropped away entirely, leaving the saloon steeped in a silence far heavier than music could have filled. Clara forced herself to stay composed, her face calm even as her heart hammered in her chest. She had played this game too many times before. She knew men like this could smell fear, and once they caught the scent, they wouldn't let it go. She adjusted her dress, lifted her chin, and met the scarred cowboy's eyes, refusing to give him the satisfaction of watching her flinch. But deep down, she knew charm alone might not be enough this time. Sadie stepped closer, sliding herself into the space between Clara and the cowboy with the kind of quiet authority that came from years of survival. She didn't raise her voice, didn't threaten him, but her very presence carried weight. Sadie had earned a reputation in town. Everyone knew she wasn't someone to be pushed aside easily. She didn't carry a gun at her hip, but she carried something far more dangerous, the unshakable look of someone who had outlasted worse men than him. Mary, however, couldn't disguise her fear. She sat frozen at her corner table, her wide eyes darting from Sadie to Clara to the group of cowboys. Her shawl slipped from her shoulders, but she didn't notice. Her breathing was shallow, every muscle in her body tense. She had never seen men like this. Men who treated every room as theirs to conquer, every woman as theirs to control. Back east, she had known men who shouted, men who drank, even men who raised fists in anger. But these cowboys were different. They carried the lawlessness of the frontier in their blood, and they seemed to enjoy the way their presence could unnerve everyone around them. The scarred cowboy leaned back against the bar, pretending at ease, though his eyes stayed locked on Sadie. "Funny thing," he said, his words slurred, but his meaning sharp. "This here place thinks it can tell men what they've had enough of. Ain't that right, boys?" His friends cheered, their boots stomping against the floorboards. Sadie's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice even. "You've already had enough trouble for one night. Don't make more of it." The cowboy laughed again, but there was no humor in it. "Trouble," he drawled. "Trouble follows me like a shadow. Maybe I ought to share a little of it." His hand hovered near his belt, close enough to make the room tense, though he didn't draw. He didn't need to. The threat alone was enough to send ripples through the crowd. Clara felt her pulse in her throat. She glanced toward the door, half hoping the sheriff might return, but she knew better. Harlan had done his part, and if he returned again, he'd bring more questions than safety. The law didn't often stand on the side of women like them. No, the Red Lantern had to find its own way through this storm. Upstairs, the other women watched from the balcony, whispering nervously. They had seen too many nights like this end in broken glass and broken bones. But they also knew that Sadie had a way of navigating storms. She had survived years of them, and they trusted her to do it again tonight. Still, trust didn't erase the fear that crept into their chests as the cowboys' voices grew louder. Mary wanted to hide, to disappear into the shadows, but some small part of her kept her rooted in place. She had run before, back east, from a different kind of danger. If she ran again, what would that make her? She forced herself to breathe, to keep her eyes open, to learn from Sadie and Clara in real time. Survival wasn't just about making it through the night. It was about learning the rules of this new world, rules no one had written down, but everyone lived by. Sadie finally broke the silence, her voice steady and low. You're not the first man to walk through these doors thinking you can take whatever you want. But you might just be the last if you push too far. The words hung in the air like smoke, and for a heartbeat, no one moved. The cowboys' friends shifted uneasily, their earlier bravado flickering. They weren't sure if Sadie was bluffing, and that uncertainty worked in her favor. The scarred cowboy smirked, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. He straightened, took a step toward her, and the room held its breath. But before he could speak, the saloon doors banged open again, slamming against the walls with a crash that startled everyone. A stranger stepped inside, tall and lean, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that immediately changed the atmosphere of the room. The cowboys glanced at him, their laughter stalling in their throats. No one knew who he was, but everyone felt the shift, like a new piece had been thrown onto a dangerous game board. Sadie's eyes flicked toward him, measuring, calculating. Clara's fingers curled tighter around her glass. Mary's breath caught, unsure whether to feel relief or fear. The stranger tipped his hat slightly, scanning the room before his gaze landed on Sadie. For a long moment, they stared at each other, as though some unspoken recognition passed between them. Then, without a word, he walked toward the bar, his boots striking the floor in deliberate rhythm. The cowboys shifted, uncertain now, their bravado cracking. The scarred one spat again, muttered something about not being afraid of shadows, but his voice lacked the same sharpness it carried before. The stranger didn't look at him, didn't even acknowledge him. He ordered a drink, calm as stone, and leaned against the bar like a man who had all the time in the world. But the women of the Red Lantern knew better. No one carried themselves like that unless they had faced danger before, and no one ignored a threat unless they had the skill to end it if they chose. Mary's heart raced, questions spilling into her mind. Who was this man? Why'd he come here tonight? And most importantly, was he a savior, or another storm about to break over them? The answer wouldn't come right away. The Red Lantern held its silence, each person waiting to see which spark would ignite first. The scarred cowboy's pride, Sadie's defiance, or the stranger's mysterious calm. The night was growing darker still, and though the piano player tried to return his hands to the keys, no melody came. Everyone knew the real music of the night hadn't yet begun, and when it did, it would echo far beyond the walls of the Red Lantern. And Mary, clutching her shawl once more, realized something she hadn't before. Survival in the Wild West wasn't just about facing the men you could see. It was about the ones who appeared when you least expected them, carrying secrets, shadows, and storms of their own. The night wasn't close to over. It was only gathering strength. The stranger's presence lingered like smoke, impossible to ignore and yet difficult to understand. He leaned at the bar, sipping his drink with the patience of a man who had nothing to prove, but his silence spoke louder than any words. Every person in the Red Lantern felt the shift in power, though no one could say exactly where it had moved. The scarred cowboy still loomed over the room, his men restless and rowdy, but their bravado cracked with every second the stranger ignored them. Sadie studied him carefully, her instincts alive. She had seen men come through town who looked dangerous but had no real fight in them. She had also seen men who carried danger like a second skin, quiet but explosive when provoked. This man was one of the latter. She could see it in the way his eyes didn't dart, in the way his body moved with purpose but no wasted effort. He wasn't afraid of the scarred cowboy, and that alone was enough to keep everyone on edge. Clara, always the one to sense undercurrents, noticed the way Sadie's focus shifted. That meant something. Sadie didn't trust easily, didn't waste her attention on men unless they carried weight in a room. Clara kept her face calm, but she tucked this observation away. If Sadie was cautious, then they all needed to be. The scarred cowboy slammed his hand on the bar, demanding attention. "You think you can stroll in here and ignore me?" He barked at the stranger, his words dripping with the whiskey he'd poured down his throat. His friends cheered him on, but their voices lacked conviction now. They were riding on his pride, not their own. The stranger didn't look at him right away. He finished his drink, set the glass down slowly, and only then turned his head. His voice, when it came, was low and steady. "I don't waste time on men who mistake noise for strength." The words sliced through the room like a blade. A hush fell so deep that even the candles seemed to flicker lower. Mary's breath caught in her throat. She gripped the edge of the table until her fingers ached, unable to look away. She had never seen tension like this, so sharp it seemed to cut the very air. Her fear grew, but mixed with it was something else, a strange and dangerous fascination. She was watching the night fold into itself, building towards something that could shatter everything in seconds. The scarred cowboy stepped forward, his boots grinding against the floor. His hand rested near his belt, and the room braced for the sound no one wanted to hear. The click of a revolver leaving its holster. Sadie moved subtly closer to Mary, positioning herself to shield her if it came to that. Clara shifted, too, her eyes never leaving the cowboy. The women had no weapons, but they had their wits, their instincts, and the unspoken pact that bound them together. The piano player's hands trembled over the keys, but he didn't play. He knew music had no place here. This was no longer a night of entertainment. This was survival, pure and raw. The cowboy sneered, his pride dragging him deeper into the fire. "You've got a sharp tongue, stranger. Let's see if you've got the spine to match it." The stranger didn't move right away. His calmness was more unnerving than any shout, more dangerous than any show of aggression. Finally, he straightened from the bar, his movements deliberate, his eyes locked on the cowboy. He didn't reach for his gun, but his posture carried a promise. If it came to steal, he would not hesitate. Mary's chest tightened. She felt caught between dread and awe. She didn't want violence, yet she couldn't pull herself away from the storm building before her. The Red Lantern, once filled with music and laughter, now felt like the stage of a deadly play. Every actor frozen at the edge of action. Sadie whispered without turning her head, her voice barely audible. "Stay still, Mary. Watch, but don't move." Mary nodded faintly, though her body shook. Her eyes stayed wide, her heart pounding with every breath. The scarred cowboy's men shifted behind him, uncertain whether to back their leader or step away from the fire he was walking into. They had followed him into countless brawls, but this was different. The stranger radiated something they couldn't name, something that made even reckless men hesitate. Then, as if the tension couldn't grow any sharper, the saloon doors creaked open once more. A gust of cold night air swept in, and standing in the doorway was Sheriff Harlan. His gaze swept the room, taking in the stillness, the coiled danger, the unspoken threat hanging heavy in the air. The sheriff didn't speak right away. He stood there, the doors swinging slowly behind him, measuring every face, every movement. Finally, his voice cut through the silence. "I told you earlier, there'd be no more trouble tonight." The scarred cowboy stiffened, caught between pride and fear, between the stranger at his front and the sheriff at his back. His men muttered nervously, their courage thinning like smoke in the wind. The room seemed to shrink, pressing the moment tighter and tighter until it felt like something had to break. Sadie's pulse raced, but her face stayed calm. Clara held her glass, steady though her hand shook slightly. Mary bit down on her lip so hard she tasted blood, too afraid to breathe, too terrified to blink. The cowboy's hand twitched near his belt. The stranger's body coiled with quiet readiness. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, his fingers brushing the edge of his holster. The Red Lantern had become a powder keg, and everyone inside knew it. One spark, just one, would set the whole night ablaze. and still no one moved. The silence stretched, unbearable, every second dripping with suspense. The women, the cowboys, the sheriff, the stranger, all caught in a fragile web of pride, fear, and survival. Mary whispered a prayer under her breath, though she wasn't sure who she was praying to anymore. The scarred cowboy's laugh broke the silence, low and jagged, but it carried no joy. "Looks like this town's got more watchdogs than I thought," he muttered, his voice heavy with challenge. His hand twitched again. The stranger's eyes hardened. The sheriff shifted his stance. The night had reached its sharpest point, the air so tense it threatened to snap. Everyone knew the next heartbeat would decide everything. And then, just as the moment balanced on the edge of breaking, the room held still, as if the world itself was waiting to see who would draw first, who would speak, who would survive. The climax hadn't yet come, but the red lantern was trembling on the very brink of it. The next evening settled over Deadwood like a heavy blanket, its air thick with the sounds of clinking glasses, distant shouts, and the restless energy of a town that never truly slept. Inside the brothel, the women moved with practiced grace, keeping their voices light, though unease tugged at every glance. Every shadow that flickered past the windows seemed longer, darker, more dangerous than before. News of the trouble on the streets, the gang fights, the reckless drinking, the mounting grudges, had reached them long before the doors opened. Still, they had no choice but to step into the night's performance, because survival here meant smiling through fear. Clara leaned against the stair railing for a moment, catching her breath. She had been entertaining a group of ranch hands earlier, men rowdy with whiskey but harmless in their laughter. Yet behind their cheer, she felt the storm building. The women all did. Tonight wasn't just another night. It carried an edge sharper than usual, as if the town itself had drawn a knife and was waiting to see where it would strike. Clara smoothed her dress, whispered a prayer no one would hear, and walked back into the parlor with a forced brightness. Belle, the madam, sat near the piano with her watchful eyes never still. She read the room the way others read scripture. Every movement, every whispered word, every crooked smile mattered. She knew how quickly a room filled with laughter could turn to chaos. She also knew that the women, her women, depended on her judgment. If she miscalculated even once, someone might not see the sunrise. Belle had lived through nights when the air went from music to gunfire in seconds, and she carried those memories like scars. Tonight, her gut told her danger wasn't outside. It was already among them. The piano man tried to drown out the tension with an upbeat tune, but his fingers betrayed him with shaky notes. The women kept moving, carrying drinks, entertaining, laughing when needed, though their eyes lingered too long on certain men. In one corner, a gambler with cold eyes had been nursing his whiskey for hours, his hand never far from the revolver at his hip. In another, a group of cowboys exchanged glances that spoke of unfinished fights. A single spark could turn the place into a battlefield. Josie slipped through the crowd with a tray, her smile convincing enough to pass as genuine. Yet inside, her mind worked like clockwork. She noticed who leaned closer to whom, who whispered too low, who kept their backs to the wall. She knew the signs of a fight about to break out, because she'd learned the hard way. Once, years ago, she had been caught in the middle of a barroom brawl that ended with 2 men dead. Since then, she made it her mission to see the trouble before it came crashing down. Tonight, all her instincts screamed that the trouble was already breathing down their necks. Outside, the streets of Deadwood churned with drunken voices and the clatter of boots on dirt. A deputy stumbled past, too deep in drink to notice the 2 men shadowing him from the alley. Across the way, a rival saloon lit up with music and shouting. But even from the brothel's window, one could sense that the joy was thin, almost forced, as though every man was daring the other to push first. The Wild West thrived on tension like this, nights when survival balanced on a razor's edge. Inside, the women exchanged glances as subtle as they were desperate. They had their own signals, small nods, quick looks, to warn each other when things felt wrong. Belle caught Clara's eye, then Josie's, silently confirming what they all felt. They were walking into the teeth of the storm. But walking away wasn't an option. Money had to be made, reputations had to be kept, and in a town like Deadwood, stepping aside could make you invisible, forgotten, and poor. They had fought too hard to stay alive and seen to surrender so easily. The night dragged on with tension stretching tighter, like a rope ready to snap. A poker game in the corner grew louder, the gambler's cold eyes narrowing at every card dealt. Clara poured drinks with trembling hands hidden by practiced gestures, her laughter covering her fear. Josie noticed the cowboys shift in their seats, their hands brushing the table too close to their guns. Belle sat straighter, her gaze steady but sharp, calculating every second. When the first glass shattered, the sound ripped through the room like a warning shot. The piano man froze mid-note, his fingers suspended over the keys. Every voice dropped to silence. Every eye turned toward the corner where the gambler stood, his whiskey dripping from the edge of the table, his stare fixed on a cowboy who had spoken too loud, too carelessly. The gambler's voice was low, dangerous, carrying more weight than a shout ever could. No one moved. Not the cowboys, not the gambler, not even the women. The parlor held its breath, waiting to see if words would be enough or if steel would be drawn. Belle rose slowly from her chair, her presence commanding though her hands stayed calm at her sides. She had broken up fights before, but this one was different. There was something in the gambler's eyes that made her stomach turn. This wasn't about cards or money. This was about something older, deeper, something that could not be solved with charm or drinks. The women watched, every muscle in their bodies ready to run, to hide, or to protect each other. Clara thought of the nights she had dreamed of leaving Deadwood behind, of escaping to some quiet town where survival didn't mean gambling with your life. Josie thought of her brother, who had once told her never to underestimate a man with nothing to lose. Belle thought of the women beside her, and how each one's life depended on her choices now. The gambler's hand hovered near his revolver, the cowboy's jaw tightened, and the room leaned toward an inevitable eruption. The piano man's hand slipped from the keys with a dull thud, breaking the silence, but not the tension. Belle took one step forward, her voice steady but edged with steel, about to say something that might shift the tide. But before a word could leave her lips, the door slammed open. A gust of cold night air swept into the room, carrying with it the sound of shouts and gunfire from outside. The men inside froze, their feud momentarily forgotten as all eyes turned to the doorway. A figure stepped in, shadowed by the lamplight, his hat low, his coat heavy with dust. No one knew who he was yet, but the air shifted instantly, the way it does when a storm changes direction. The women stiffened, the men straightened, and the gambler's hand stayed near his gun. Whoever the stranger was, he wasn't just another drifter passing through. The night had just taken a darker turn, and the brothel, already bracing for violence, was about to face a danger none of them had expected. And as the door closed behind him, the sound of the outside world muffled, the room seemed to shrink, every heart beating louder than the piano could ever play. What came next would decide whether this night ended in survival or in tragedy. The stranger stood in the doorway, his figure framed by the flickering lantern light that spilled from the street behind him. For a moment, he didn't move, and neither did the room. The silence was heavy, stretched thin, broken only by the faint creak of wood as someone shifted uneasily in their chair. His boots were coated in dust, his long coat brushing the floor with every step as he finally entered. The brim of his hat hid most of his face, but what little was visible showed a man weathered by travel, scarred by battles that no one dared ask about. Belle's eyes narrowed. She had seen enough men pass through Deadwood to know when one carried more than just a story. This man carried danger in his shadow. He didn't swagger like the drunkards, and he didn't linger like gamblers. He moved with intent, steady, slow, every step measured as if he already knew how this night would end. The gambler at the corner, who had been moments from drawing his gun, shifted his gaze toward the stranger, his expression hardening. The cowboys, too, turned their attention, uneasy but alert. Trouble had already been brewing, but now it had a new face. Clara, standing near the bar, tightened her grip on the bottle in her hand. Josie edged closer to her, whispering so low that no one else could hear. "Who is he?" she asked, her voice trembling. Clara shook her head. "I don't know, but he doesn't look like a man you want to cross." The stranger finally spoke, his voice calm, but carrying across the room like a knife slicing the air. "I'm looking for someone." That was enough to set the room off balance. Everyone glanced at one another, but no one dared answer. His words weren't angry, but there was something behind them, a promise that if he didn't find who he was searching for, something far worse would follow. Belle straightened, her voice sharp but polite. "And who might that be?" The stranger lifted his head, revealing eyes that seemed to have seen too much of the West. Cold, steady eyes. He scanned the room once before speaking again. "A man who owes me blood." The words dropped heavy, louder than a gunshot, though they were spoken barely above a whisper. The gambler's hand twitched, the cowboy's stiffened, and the piano man's fingers hovered uselessly over the keys. This was no ordinary night anymore. The brothel was no longer a refuge of laughter and drinks. It had become a battlefield waiting to be claimed. Clara's heart hammered in her chest. She looked at Josie, who looked back with wide eyes, both knowing that whoever the stranger sought, the search would not end quietly. Belle, however, did not flinch. She stepped forward, every eye in the room following her, and said carefully, "This is no place for blood debts. You'll have to take your business elsewhere." The stranger tilted his head, his jaw tight. For a long, agonizing pause, no one moved. Then, he reached into his coat, not for a gun, but for a small, crumpled photograph. He sat on the bar, sliding it forward with one finger. "He's here," he said firmly. Clara's eyes darted to the photograph. The face was blurred and worn from travel, but even so, she thought she recognized the features. Her stomach dropped. She turned her head slightly, not wanting Belle to see the panic in her eyes. Whoever this man was looking for, Clara feared she knew the answer. The gambler at the corner stood slowly, his hand finally leaving his glass. The room shifted again, breaths held tight, the tension almost unbearable. "You've been looking in the wrong towns," the gambler said coolly, his voice sharp as a blade. "But you found me now." The stranger didn't blink. "Then tonight ends one way." Josie grabbed Clara's wrist tightly, whispering, "We need to move. If this breaks loose, we'll be caught in the middle." But Clara couldn't move. Her feet felt nailed to the floor, her body frozen as the two men stared each other down. Belle's mind raced. She had broken up fights before, outsmarted drunkards, and even stared down cowboys with short tempers. But this was different. This wasn't a matter of pride or cards or money. This was a matter of vengeance, and vengeance rarely left room for peace. The gambler and the stranger squared off, neither man drawing yet, but both ready. The women of the brothel braced themselves, exchanging looks that spoke more than words ever could. They knew what would happen if bullets flew in the parlor. The walls would not protect them, and there would be no sheriff rushing in to save the day. Survival would come down to instincts, courage, and luck. The piano man, trembling, tried to slip out of his seat, but the sudden scrape of the bench against the floor caught the attention of both men. Their hands moved almost in unison, hovering near their revolvers. The sound was enough to make the entire room gasp, as though they were witnessing the pull of an invisible trigger. Outside, another gunshot echoed from the street, followed by a man's scream. The chaos in Deadwood was spilling closer, and it was only a matter of time before it swallowed the brothel whole. Inside, the women exchanged frantic glances. Clara's lips parted, as though she might scream, but no sound came. Josie pressed herself against the wall, her breath short, her hands shaking. The stranger's voice broke the silence again, low but unwavering. "You know what you did, and tonight it ends." The gambler smirked, but his hand stayed near his gun. "You're a fool if you think you'll walk out of here alive." At that, Belle stepped forward once more, her voice raised, sharp and commanding. "Stop this. Not in my house." For a second, it seemed her words might break through, might bring a sliver of sense to two men blinded by vengeance. But before either could answer, the front window shattered. A bullet tore through the glass, lodging itself deep into the wood of the piano with a deafening crash. The room erupted into screams, gasps, and the sound of scrambling feet. The women ducked, the piano man dove for cover, and the cowboys cursed as they drew their weapons. Clara grabbed Josie and pulled her down behind the bar, their hearts pounding in their throats. Belle remained standing, her body rigid, her face pale but steady. The gambler and the stranger had both drawn their revolvers now, their eyes locked, their hands steady despite the chaos. The parlor had become a powder keg, and the first to pull the trigger would light the fuse. But then, the front door burst open again. Another figure stormed in, shouting over the noise, his voice desperate and raw. "They're coming. A whole gang, armed to the teeth." The room froze again, as if one nightmare had been replaced by another. The stranger turned his head slightly, the gambler's smirk faltered, and the women's fear deepened. Whatever had haunted the night so far was only the beginning. The true danger had arrived, and the brothel, the place where they had spent every night walking the thin line between survival and disaster, was about to face its deadliest test yet. The room seemed to stop breathing after the shout. The man at the doorway, his chest heaving, eyes wild with fear, looked like he had outrun death itself to bring the warning. His clothes were torn, dust clung to his face, and blood streaked one arm where he'd clearly been grazed. He staggered forward, clutching the frame, as if even standing upright was a battle. "They're coming," he gasped again, his voice raw. "Not just a handful, a whole gang, and they're hunting for blood." Every soul in the brothel froze, the truth of his words hitting harder than the bullet that had shattered the window seconds earlier. Clara's fingers dug into Josie's arm, and Josie's eyes darted from the gambler to the stranger to Belle, trying to make sense of what could happen next. The piano man slumped beneath his instrument, whispering a prayer to himself. Belle's gaze stayed locked on the door, her mind racing faster than her pulse. The stranger's revolver never lowered. He stood steady, but his attention wavered between the gambler before him and the chaos outside. For a moment, he seemed to calculate whether his vengeance mattered more than the threat bearing down on them. The gambler, sensing the shift, tightened his grip on his own gun. He wasn't about to let fear of an approaching gang rob him of his pride or his life. But then the wounded man at the door collapsed to his knees, his voice breaking as he forced out more words. "They're not just coming for the streets. They're coming here. They said it plain. This house, this place. They want to burn it to the ground." Gasps spread through the parlor. The women exchanged horrified glances, every muscle tightening with dread. It wasn't random chaos anymore. It wasn't just Deadwood's usual drunken violence spilling out into the night. This was targeted. Someone wanted the brothel destroyed, and everyone inside with it. Belle's mind shot to her women first, Clara, Josie, and the others who had trusted her to keep them safe. Her chest ached with the weight of it, but her face betrayed nothing. "Why here?" she demanded, her voice sharp, commanding, refusing to let panic take hold. The wounded man looked up, his eyes clouded with fear and exhaustion. "Because of him," he said, pointing a trembling hand at the gambler. "They said you crossed them one time, too many. Tonight, they settle it." The gambler's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The truth hung heavy in the air, and with it came the realization that every innocent soul in the room was now dragged into his fight. Clara's stomach turned, her throat dry. She had always known their lives were fragile, that danger hovered over them with every night's work, but this felt cruel in a way she hadn't prepared for. Josie's voice broke in a shaky whisper. "They'll kill us all." The stranger finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "Then maybe tonight we have the same enemy." His revolver stayed pointed toward the gambler, but his words carried a weight that made the room shiver. The gambler smirked bitterly. "Don't think for a second I need your help." Belle cut across both of them, her voice sharp as a whip. "Enough. Whatever feud you men have, it ends here. Because if we don't stand together, none of us make it through the night." Her eyes locked on the gambler, then the stranger, daring them to defy her. "You want to kill each other? Fine. Do it tomorrow. Tonight, If you don't fight for this house, you'll die in it. The women straightened at her words, finding strength in Belle's defiance. Clara swallowed her fear, pulling Josie close, whispering, "We'll survive this. We have to." But deep inside, doubt coiled like a snake, hissing with every echo of gunfire outside. The tension shifted again as the sound of hooves thundered in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Lantern light flickered through the broken window, shadows of mounted men cutting across the walls. The gang was almost there. And then came the second twist, the sound of boots pounding on the floor above. Every head jerked upward as the ceiling groaned under hurried footsteps. The women froze, their breaths caught in their throats. Someone was already inside the brothel. Belle's face drained of color. She had checked every lock herself, every door bolted, every window latched. Yet now, clear as day, the sound of someone moving overhead echoed down the stairwell. Clara's hand went to her mouth, Josie's eyes filled with tears, and the piano man pressed himself flatter against the wall as though the boards could swallow him. The gambler cursed under his breath, his revolver lifting toward the staircase. The stranger didn't move his aim from the gambler, but shifted his body slightly, ready for whatever came down. The wounded man at the door tried to push himself upright, but his strength was gone, his warning spent. The footsteps slowed, creaked, then stopped. For a moment, the silence was unbearable, a silence thick with the weight of 100 questions. Who had slipped inside? Was it one of the gang already ahead of their attack? Or someone else entirely? Someone who had waited for this night to make their move? The women looked to Belle, their leader, their anchor, their hope. Her heart pounded, but her voice came steady, even as her eyes flicked from the staircase to the door where the shadows of more riders gathered outside. "Get ready," she said, each word sharp as a blade. "The worst night of our lives is just beginning." The gambler shifted his stance, his finger twitching near the trigger. The stranger didn't blink. The sound of horses outside grew deafening, and from above, the stairwell groaned once more as whoever lurked there began to descend, one slow step at a time. The parlor had become a trap, the women caught between vengeance, betrayal, and a gang set on their destruction. And as the first shadow stretched across the stairs, they knew that what happened in the next few minutes would decide who lived to see the dawn and who didn't. The first creak of the stair sent a chill through the parlor deeper than the night air outside. Every eye turned upward, every breath caught in suspense as the shadow above shifted into the shape of a man. The lantern light from below stretched him tall against the wall, making him appear larger, more menacing. Step by step, he descended, his boots slow, deliberate, each sound a reminder that the danger was no longer just outside. The danger was already here. Belle's voice was low, but firm, steady enough to hold the room together. "Show yourself." The man on the stairs didn't hurry. He reached the landing, the dim light catching his face. He was no outlaw anyone in the room recognized, not one of the cowboys or gamblers who passed through Deadwood. His face was pale, sharp, his eyes like chips of stone. He looked too calm for a man walking into a room already braced for violence. He carried himself like someone who knew more than anyone else here, and that terrified Clara more than the guns pointed in every direction. "Evening," he said, his voice smooth, unsettlingly polite. "Seems I've arrived at the right time." Belle took a single step forward, keeping her posture strong though her hands tightened at her sides. "Who are you?" The stranger with the revolver didn't lower his weapon, and the gambler's jaw worked with barely concealed rage. The women huddled near the bar, eyes darting between the new arrival and the door where the gang's shadows grew longer. Outside, the clamor of hooves and shouting men thickened, pressing closer, as if the entire town was being swallowed by a tide of violence. The man on the stairs smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's say I'm a messenger, and my message is simple. Tonight, this house falls." Gasps rippled through the parlor. Clara's stomach twisted, and Josie's breath caught sharp in her throat. Belle didn't flinch, but her face hardened, her suspicion confirmed. This wasn't random. The brothel wasn't simply in the path of chaos. It was the target. The gambler sneered. So they sent you to warn us? Or to finish the job yourself? The man tilted his head slightly, as if amused. Neither. I'm here to make sure nothing stands in their way. You've angered men with long memories and short tempers. And tonight, debts will be collected. The stranger, still locked on the gambler, spoke at last, his voice low with restrained fury. So it's true. They want him dead, and they don't care who else burns with him. The messenger's eyes flicked to the stranger, then back to the gambler. You're quick, but it won't matter. By dawn, this place will be nothing but ash. The women recoiled, terror breaking through the fragile wall of composure they'd built. Clara pulled Josie tighter, whispering that they'd find a way out, though her own voice betrayed her fear. The piano man clutched the keys as though they could protect him. Belle's gaze cut through the room like steel, her mind running faster than her heart. She knew one thing. They had only minutes before the gang stormed through the front door. And now, with this messenger already inside, their chances of survival had shrunk to almost nothing. The gambler snarled, his revolver lifting. You want me? Then let's end it here. The messenger didn't even flinch. He spread his hands slightly, his calm unbroken. Oh, I'm not here to draw blood. That's their work. I only came to see your faces before the fire took you. That sent another ripple of dread through the room. It wasn't just a fight coming. It was destruction, a blaze meant to wipe the place clean, to erase the women and their sanctuary in one brutal stroke. The stranger's voice hardened. If you think we'll stand here and wait for death, you're mistaken. Belle seized that moment, her tone cutting through the chaos like a whip. Listen to me, she snapped, forcing every set of eyes to her. You can fight each other all you want, but if you don't fight them, none of us will see daylight. This is our only chance. For the first time, the gambler hesitated. His hand trembled slightly, his eyes shifting from Belle to the stranger, then to the messenger who still stood calm and steady on the stairs. Pride warred with survival in his expression, and for the first time, doubt began to break through. Outside, the gang shouted, their voices clearer now, their words sharp. Burn it down, one cried. Another voice followed, darker, crueler. Not a soul lives. The women's faces drained of color. Josie pressed her hands over her ears as though she could block out the words. Clara whispered prayers under her breath, tears pricking her eyes. The piano man sobbed quietly, his faith slipping with every passing second. The messenger descended the last step, his boots landing firm on the parlor floor. Your time is up, he said simply. The front door rattled as fists pounded against it. The window cracked again under the butt of a rifle. The gang was seconds away from breaking through, and the room knew it. The stranger stepped forward, his revolver shifting away from the gambler at last, pointing toward the door. Then we fight. Belle's chest rose, her eyes blazing. Then we survive. The gambler cursed under his breath, but he raised his weapon too, fury and fear mixing in his glare. He wasn't about to let his enemies see him beg. The women braced themselves, some ducking low, others clutching anything they could use to shield themselves. Clara held Josie close, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Belle's heart thundered, but her face stayed strong for the women who depended on her. The pounding at the door grew louder, splinters flying with every hit. The gang outside shouted louder, their boots stomping like thunder. The messenger, still calm, stepped back into the shadows, content to watch. And then, with one final crack, the door burst inward. The gang poured in like a flood, torches in one hand, guns in the other, their eyes wild, their voices a chorus of rage. Flames flickered, smoke thickened, and the parlor became a battlefield in the blink of an eye. The women screamed, the gambler fired first, and the stranger moved like lightning. Belle shouted orders, pulling her women towards safety. Clara's vision blurred with smoke. Her lungs burned, but she clung to Josie with all her strength. The night had turned into a nightmare, and the brothel, a place of survival and fragile peace, was now the heart of a war. And as the fire caught the curtains, licking upward toward the ceiling, it became clear that not everyone would make it out alive. The night had reached its peak when everything finally came crashing together. The town was buzzing with whispers, the saloon piano thumping out nervous tunes, and the brothel workers braced themselves for what they felt was coming. The storm outside raged like a reflection of the storm within the walls of the dusty Wild West town. It wasn't just another night of survival. It was the night where all the stories, fears, and dangers they had endured seemed to collide at once. Clara stood at the heart of it all. She had carried secrets for too long, and the burden of keeping them hidden had weighed on her soul. Now, with blood spilled on the dusty floor of the saloon and shadows of betrayal stretching longer than the lamplight, she knew there was no turning back. The outlaw who had been circling the town for weeks finally revealed his hand. He wasn't just another drifter causing trouble. He was someone who had ties to the very brothel that had given Clara and the others a fragile sense of home. He had once been trusted. He had once been close. And now, he was here to tear everything down. The sheriff was caught in a snare of his own making. His alliance with powerful men in town had left him compromised, unable to fully protect the women who relied on him. When the outlaw burst into the saloon, demanding money and threatening violence, the sheriff froze between duty and fear. The workers, those women society often dismissed, were forced to stand taller than the men with badges and guns. They had faced danger before, but this was different. This time the danger was personal, tangled in history, betrayal, and unfinished grudges. The air grew heavy with gunpowder and sweat as voices rose. Cards scattered from the table as one gambler ducked beneath the bar. Lamps flickered. Then, in a flash of sound and smoke, the room erupted. Shots rang out, glass shattered, and screams echoed down the street. But amid the chaos, Clara stepped forward. She had always been the one who stitched torn dresses and broken spirits. But tonight, she carried something far heavier, a determination that no one expected. The outlaw aimed for her, sneering as though certain she would break. But Clara didn't falter. With steady eyes, she revealed what she had carried in silence for years. She knew him, knew his past, knew his real name, a truth that cut deeper than any bullet. The revelation shook the room to its core. The workers gasped, the sheriff staggered, and the outlaw's grip trembled for just a moment too long. In the Wild West, secrets were as deadly as guns, and Clara had just fired the most dangerous weapon of all, truth. The fight that followed was not just about who could draw fastest, but about survival, loyalty, and justice. Every worker who had once been seen as powerless suddenly revealed strength born of countless nights of fear. They moved together, protecting one another, refusing to let the outlaw's rage consume them. The saloon transformed into a battlefield, not just of bullets, but of willpower. And when the dust finally settled, the women stood, scarred but unbroken, as the outlaw lay defeated on the wooden floor. The sheriff, shaken and ashamed, tried to claim control of the scene, but it was clear he no longer held the authority he once thought he had. The true power that night had come from those who had been underestimated, those who had been forced to survive in the harshest shadows of the Wild West. The brothel workers had saved themselves, not by chance, but by courage, by unity, and by the unspoken bond that had tied them through years of hardship. But just as relief began to wash over them, a final twist unraveled. The outlaw, weakened and bleeding, let out a broken laugh. His words slithered through the silence of the room, leaving a new fear clinging to everyone's skin. He wasn't the only one. There were more. Men tied to him. Men coming for the same revenge. Men who knew the weaknesses of the town and the names of every woman inside the brothel. This night, as terrifying as it had been, was only the beginning. The storm outside howled louder, rattling the windows as if warning them of what was to come. Clara felt her breath catch, her body heavy with exhaustion, but her spirit unwilling to break. The women had fought and won a battle, but now they were staring into the mouth of a war. The outlaw's dying words weren't just a threat. They were a promise that the darkest nights of their lives were still waiting beyond the horizon. And as the lamps flickered low and the thunder cracked above the desert sky, The women of the Wild West brothel stood shoulder to shoulder, staring at one another with fear and determination. They knew the fight wasn't over. They knew survival would demand more from them than ever before. And as the outlaw's voice faded into silence, the truth settled in their bones. Those deadly nights they thought they had endured were nothing compared to what was coming. Would they endure what lay ahead, or would the next storm finally break them apart? The answer hung in the air like smoke, waiting for dawn to bring either salvation or another fight for their lives. The storm finally broke with the first light of dawn, rain tapering off into silence as the desert sun pushed its way across the horizon. The town, battered and shaken, stirred slowly awake. The saloon smelled of gunpowder and smoke, its wooden floors scarred with bullet holes and blood. For hours the workers sat together in the quiet aftermath, bandaging wounds, comforting one another, and staring at the empty chair where the outlaw had fallen. His last words still lingered in the air, like an echo no one could chase away, but the fear no longer held them in chains. Instead, there was a strange calm, a sense that they had crossed a line and would never be seen the same again. Clara sat by the window, looking out at the washed streets, her thoughts heavy but clear. For years she had carried shame, secrets, and the constant fear of not surviving another night. But now she realized survival was more than just making it to morning. It was about standing up when no one expected you to, about refusing to let the world write your story for you. The others, from Rosie with her quick laugh to quiet Evelyn who had always kept to herself, shared the same look in their eyes. They had endured the Wild West's deadliest nights, but they had done it together, and that bond had turned strangers into something closer to family. The sheriff stopped by just after sunrise, his hat in his hands and shame etched deep into the lines of his face. He tried to speak, to explain himself, but the words came out hollow. Everyone knew he had chosen silence when he should have chosen courage. Clara met his gaze with a steady calm, not with anger, but with the kind of disappointment that cut deeper than rage. "You had the badge," she told him softly, "but you didn't carry the weight of it." The sheriff bowed his head, knowing he could never regain what he had lost. The women didn't need him anymore, not for protection, not for justice. They had proven that when no one stood for them, they stood for themselves. As the day stretched on, townsfolk began drifting into the saloon, whispering among themselves about what had happened. Men who had once scoffed at the brothel workers now looked at them differently, with a mix of awe and unease. The women weren't invisible anymore. Their courage had been witnessed, and though some still looked at them with judgment, others carried a new respect that had never existed before. In a town where survival was often about who carried the biggest gun, it had been the underestimated who had stood their ground and lived to tell the story. Rosie patched up the broken piano, and before long, soft music filled the saloon again. It wasn't the same carefree tune as before. It carried a weight, a depth, a reminder that beauty could still exist even after the darkest nights. Evelyn, who had always hidden in the shadows, began helping to rebuild, her quiet strength shining brighter now that fear no longer kept her silent. Every woman found herself changed in some way. The scars would remain, but they had become reminders, not of weakness, but of resilience. The outlaw's threat of others coming never left their minds, but instead of letting it consume them, they prepared. They reinforced the brothel, found allies among townsfolk who were tired of corruption and fear, and built a network of watchful eyes. The workers were no longer just women surviving in the shadows of the Wild West. They had become protectors of one another, guardians of their fragile freedom. The brothel, once seen only as a place of whispers, became a stronghold where loyalty and courage thrived. Weeks passed, and the desert slowly softened under spring rains. The nights were still dangerous, the world still unforgiving, but the women walked through it with heads high. Clara kept her place by the window, always watchful, always steady, but no longer alone in her burden. The sisterhood they had forged became their greatest weapon against whatever storm might come next. The sheriff eventually left town, his name fading into the dust. New lawmen came, but none could erase the memory of that night when the women stood without him. It became part of the town's whispered history, a story told over poker games and quiet drinks. A story of brothel workers who had survived the deadliest nights, who had faced down fear and violence and lived not as victims, but as fighters. For Clara, the lesson lingered deep in her heart. She realized the Wild West had always tried to define her by her circumstances, to limit her worth to the walls she lived within. But survival had taught her something different. She was more than what the world saw. They all were. And though history might not remember their names, their strength would live on in the stories told long after the dust had settled. As another evening approached, lanterns glowed in the brothel windows, casting warm light into the dark streets. Music drifted once again, laughter returned, and though danger was never far, neither was their courage. They had weathered the storm and come out stronger. And in a world where the night was always filled with shadows, they had learned to be the ones who carried the light. The story of the Wild West often speaks of gunfighters, sheriffs, and outlaws, but hidden beneath those tales are the lives of women who endured more than history ever admits. They were the ones who held each other up, who braved the deadliest nights with nothing but grit and loyalty, who taught that survival is not just about living through danger. It's about finding strength where no one expects it. And so the brothel workers of that dusty town became more than just a footnote in a forgotten chapter. They became proof that even in the harshest corners of the frontier, courage could be found in unlikely places. The world might have seen them as fragile, but the truth was far greater. They were survivors. They were fighters. They were the heartbeat of the Wild West's untold story.